Hey everyone, and welcome to the first video in the Let's Build series. A new thing that I'm trying out that'll be a bit different than what I normally make, but hopefully something as fun and interesting to you guys. The idea behind this series is I want to produce something that's less dense than a tutorial, but more articulate than a live stream, where I can just talk about what I'm doing throughout the process of building the model from start to finish. For this first series, I'll be modeling Mina, the titular character from Yacht Club's new IP, Mina the Hollower. I don't know why, but whenever I see this title, I always want to spell it Hallower, not Hollower. I think that's something to do with the fact that she's got a classical Belmont vibe going on. After all, there's no doubt that they thought what they were doing was holy work. To get started, I'm going to begin by making the head, which for me is normally a subdivided cube. For some reason, the first pass that I took with this cube, I tried to mirror it first and then subdivide it, but that didn't really work out too well. I'm too lazy to fix it, so I started over and I subdivided it first before deleting the right side and adding a mirror modifier. You'll often see me pull up a menu like this that has a variety of different options on it. This is Blender's quick favorite option that allows you to right click on certain elements and add them to a quick favorite bar, which I can access by hitting Q. Though I'm not sure how that actually plays on a normal control scheme. I'm still used to the old days of Blender 2.7, so I'm still using right click to select things. I'm just too used to it to want to change now. Once I got the mirror modifier on, I turned on proportional editing and started to shape Mina's head the way that I saw it from a reference I was looking at off screen. Then for the ears, I added a cube and stretched it out to make it closer to the shape that I needed, subdividing as I go to make it more round. Once I got the ears into position, I decided to remove some of the edges from the head to tame down the topology. I wanted to reduce the head down to its most fundamental shape. And from there, I started work on adding the little tufts of hair at the side of her cheeks. And I did this by selecting this edge at the side of her head and subdividing it from a context window that I got by hitting W. And to clean up the topology, I triangulated the resulting faces by selecting them and hitting T. Now, the reason why I'm going ahead and triangulating these structures is because of the way faces are sort of dynamically calculated. Regardless of how many sides a polygon has, it will always be broken up into tries. And the way these tries are calculated are dependent entirely on the structure of the polygon, meaning that if the polygons change, the tries might change. So for rigging purposes, I'm going ahead and triangulating these areas just so it'll be less of a headache later. Speaking of triangulating, I did some more of that when I subdivided these edges back behind the hair tufts to create a sort of more tapering shape akin to hair. That kind of small detail really added to the shape of the head more than you would think. And to finish off the head for the moment, I took this edge right here and subdivided it to form the bridge of her nose and muzzle. After some small tweaks and playing around with proportion, I decided it was time to add the clip in her right ear. I don't know why I ended up doing this so early in the modeling process. This ended up having ramifications down the line when I got to UV mapping that would have just been easier to deal with if I had just waited. I don't think I had the patience though. So I added the Boolean modifier and a cube to punch out the hole, and I just ended up taking the ears and just separating them from the head altogether for a time being, since the Boolean modifier has a tendency to mess with you. So I decided to apply both the mirror and Boolean modifier and clean up the artifacts by merging together the extra vertices that were somehow created during the Boolean process. And then I added some subdivisions to make the clip in her ear a little bit rounder. And then I did some things that I would end up undoing later. I decided to add sharps to the clip in her ear, so I selected the edges of them and marked them sharp, and in the object data properties, I toggled auto smoothing. I had done this because I wanted to make it really apparent that there was a chunk of her ear missing, but I later changed my mind. I'll get to it eventually. After making that mistake for a now past future self, I went on to make the lowest poly neck I think I have ever done. I took these two triangles on the underside of her head and inset it with the boundaries turned off. I shaped them up, flattened them out, and then I extruded them down to make Mina the Pez dispenser. With the neck in place, we can now begin to transition into her overcoat and her also coat? Is she wearing two different types of coats? Maybe the undergarment is like a vest or something. Who knows? Anyway, I started to make the collar for what I'm going to tentatively call her waistcoat by subdividing these two edges on the back of her neck to split them into two quads, and then joining this new edge to the front by selecting the adjacent vertices and hitting J. It's a technique that I've been using but haven't really explained much on. You'll often see me triangulating things this way, and it's because it's the most efficient way to do so. Using the knife tool can be finicky because I can straight up miss the vertices I'm trying to join and have to undo them. That, and I also have to manually select the knife tool to use it, which is already too many clicks for me. And the triangulate hotkey sometimes breaks up polygons in ways that I don't want them to. So the J hotkey is a nice compromise between the two. At this point, I'll probably have the collars set up in a way that I'd like them to be, and also have started making the shoulders. Since the neck was already so low poly, I've had to go out of my way to make new topology before continuing down the torso. So I disabled clipping in the mirror modifier for a hot second and extruded out from the neck. While I was at it, I also set up the topology to extrude the collar from the overcoat when I realized something was off. There was suddenly a very clear divide down the middle of the model, which is a sign that something is very wrong. My first thought was to check for an internal face that was connecting the mirroring halves, but that wasn't it. Then I checked to see if the edges at the center of the model were actually connected and not just crossing over each other somehow. It turns out that when I turned clipping off to extrude the shoulders, I accidentally turned off merging as well. Whoops. After that short debacle, I started to extrude the torso down when I added a loop cut to the back of the, back? The soon-to-be back? Yeah, sure. Anyway, I did this because otherwise there would be an odd distribution of topology along the torso. Without this subdivision, the front side would have 2 faces to work with, while the back would only have 1. That, and also by adding this subdivision, it gives the torso a total of 16 edges with 8 edges on each side, unlike how it was, where it was 14 edges total with 7 on each side. Generally speaking, I try to avoid odd number edges. I try to stick to shapes that can easily be broken down into quads, so 4, 6, 8, 16, it just keeps things simple. Once the top of the torso was made and ready to be extruded down, I decided I wanted to split the edges where the overcoat overlaps with the waistcoat to create some depth. So I selected the vertices where this overlap would start and hit Alt-V to rip the edges while at the same time filling in the holes that a normal vertex rip would make. It didn't fully work on the top vertex, but that's probably due to the collar causing some problems. After doing this, I selected the newly created edges, added some sharps, and then went on to turn on auto smoothing, which added to the effect that the cloth had ended at that point. Honestly, I've noticed that a lot of people don't seem to use the auto smoothing feature when it comes to low poly artwork. They tend to leave everything flat, which can work if you're doing a stylized, super hot kind of thing, but in general, I don't think it looks good. It makes the models look extraordinarily blocky. Now, I'm not saying that PlayStation 1 or N64 models weren't chunky. GoldenEye is about as chunky as you can get. But the problem is Blender's using raycast lighting, and having everything shaded flat makes everything look extra blocky. Now, to remedy this, there are 2 methods that come to mind, either by using completely shaderless materials and having painted or vertex color shadows, or by simply using smoothing and sharps like I'm doing now. After playing around with the normals on the shoulder, I began to extrude the torso down and the shoulders out, always making sure that the shapes are correct before continuing. I made sure the shoulders were nice and circular and that the torso was nice and round and not blocky, which did end up requiring some triangulation. Once the shape profiles were good, I started to extrude down more, and it was at this point that I wanted the overcoat to open up. And to do that, I used my galactic brain to push the edges I needed over by a quad by triangulating this face of the coat, moving the vertex over, joining the edges of the inner seam to continue the coat, and then spending 10 seconds struggling to dissolve this one single edge. Then I did some proportional tweaking to make the chest less flattened to fit it to the shape of the rib cage and whatnot. I also decided that this was the point that the overcoat would end, so I needed to create an edge to communicate this. Instead of selecting all the edges at the bottom of the coat that I needed and extruding them all at once, I instead must have lost most of my IQ as I proceeded to extrude them all individually and then connect them together when I was done. After wiping up the drool that was beginning to puddle at my desk from being so fucking stupid, I continued to extrude down from where the waistcoat would now be ending. I briefly turned off clipping in the mirroring modifier to open up where the waistcoat begins to part, and by using my noodle for once, made a face out of the bottom to inset and extrude all the edges at once. I struggled for a second trying to figure out where to extrude from there, and then went back to clean up the edges and mark sharps on the coat to make it look nicer. At one point or another, I was thinking about adding a modeled button to the front of her waistcoat, but quickly decided against it since whiting it properly for a rig wouldn't be feasible or sensible. I merged these vertices at the bottom of the waist to restore the edge count back to an optimal 16, and after some more proportional editing, it was time to begin the leg and pelvis region. I extruded down one more time and began to construct the bottom of the pelvis. In my mind, I'm trying to make something like a leotard. I'm taking the centermost and backmost faces and extruding them down and trying to connect them to each other. And from the resulting hole is where the legs will be extruded from. At the same time, I'm also trying to keep an optimal edge count for the legs. Since the torso is 16, the legs should have 8. I had to do a little bit of math in my head to make sure I got it right. To make this easier, you should be able to right-click the bottom bar of your Blender window and be able to toggle Scene Statistics, which should provide you with useful information such as face count, edge count, vert count, you know, the works. Once this leotard is made, I did some proportional editing to make Mina sufficiently thick, and then started to extrude down towards the knee. I noticed in writing this script that I point out a lot when I'm doing proportional editing, but really it's important to know that it's a constantly adjusting process. I'm always looking out and trying to improve on proper form and proportions, because if it doesn't look good in this untextured form, then it's not going to look good when it is textured. Just something to keep in mind if I don't bring it up moving forward. Once I extrude down from the hips, I slowly straighten out the edge loops as they come closer to where the knee will begin. Speaking of which, it's time to do now. To start it, I selected the two front edges and then extruded them out, and then joined the extrusion back to the knee and then extended it down again. And then I did it again. Now you may be asking, was there an easier way to do this? And the answer was yes. I could have just extruded the leg ring down twice and extruded the knee from there and did some merging, but will I remember it next time? Probably not. Once I got done centering the kneecap, I extruded the ring down and began construction on the foot. Since I envisioned Mina being digigrade in nature, meaning she stands on her paws or toes, I'm leaving the ankle lifted. And here's another instance where my brain rivals the smoothness of a ball bearing. For the foot, I could have just extruded the edge ring down twice and then extruded out from the front, since it's basically just making a right angle turn. I don't know why I do these things. I added a quick loop cut to add a calf muscle and then finished out the heel after taking all that time to make literally what is just an extruded, subdivided cube for a foot. It was finally time to add the toes, and instead of trying to form them from the front of the foot, which I could have done, it would be much easier to just make the toes first and then connect them all together. So I deleted the front face of what is currently a flesh nub and made a very basic cube toe. If I was smart, whenever I made fingers or toes, what I would have done at this point is I would have UV mapped them, so when I duplicated them to make the rest of the toes, they would all share the same texture space, and I wouldn't be a pain in the ass later, but I forget to do this every single time. Once the toes are all made, they are then connected together at the webbings by merging them like this, and then this ring is extruded out. This ring has to match the same number of edges as the foot, so that way they cleanly connect and deform properly when rigged. And with that, we've now finished the legs. And now to do the arms, and this process is largely the same as the legs. However, since it has a different shape profile, the elbow joint is going to be slightly different. Basically, all I'm going to be doing is at the edge where the elbow will be is giving it a 3-edge bevel and then pinching together where the joint will bend. It's not the best topology for a joint like this, but it works decently enough. Also, since her arms are clothed in what I can assume is a rather loose coat, I'm not going to have to worry about subdividing the forearm or upper arm to create the volume for the muscles that are there. I will, however, be creating topology where the cuff of the sleeve is. At first I started trying to make the cuff from a loop cut that I beveled and trying to get it into shape that way, which turned out to be a dumb idea. Once I put down the paint can I was drinking from, I used the normal transform orientation to shape the face I left when I deleted it. I scaled it on the Z normal to flatten it, and then scaled it again on the Y normal to taper it down towards the wrist where the arm is the flattest. I extruded out this face, and then using the new ring of faces I just created, extruded out the shape of the cuff. After tinking around with the shape of the cuff, I ended up shortening the arms since I had made them too long. And I was about to begin working on the hands when I was suddenly distracted by a very beautiful lack of tail that Mina had. And I decided I would remedy this right away. So what I did was I took these two faces right here, did a little inset on them, and then started to extrude them out into a tail. Really, it was that easy. When I was done, I used the proportional editor to taper the tail towards the end, and the only conundrum I had was to decide whether or not I was going to use a pointed or a blunted tip for the tail. I settled on a blunted tip because it would look nicer. Once I was done with the tail, not only did I realize that Mina was currently buried under the global floor axis, but she was also legally large enough to warrant a military response if she had ever stepped foot in Japan. So I went about putting her feet on the ground and then making her small enough to be winnable at a carnival game for 5,000 tickets. After that, I went back to making the hand, made a small whoopsie doodle, and then inset the cuff so that way I could extrude the wrist from it. After I got the wrist looking the way that I wanted it, and cleaning up some unnecessary sharps, I began to extrude out the hand. The hand should be flat and continue tapering towards the fingers, while also remaining wider than the wrist. So I made sure to keep this in mind and also provide enough topology for the thumbs. All of the fingers on the hand, the thumbs included, are going to be jointed just like the elbow was, meaning I'm going to be beveling at the edges where their joints will be and then pinching together where the fingers will bend towards. It's relatively simple geometry, but it can still be a little bit annoying to handle. Now that the thumb is done, we have to make the fingers. And since the hand is cartoony, we'll only need 3 of them. And just like the toes, we're going to make the fingers first and then connect them to the hand. However, unlike the toes, the fingers are going to have a more natural bend to them so they can deform properly. The process of making a finger is pretty easy. You just have to take a cube, stretch it out and taper it at the end, give it some loop cups, and then throw a bevel on and pinch the points together. For bonus points, we can bend the finger at these joints so that way they look more natural or at rest. And what's that? Did I unwrap the fingers before duplicating them to save myself time in the future? Can you guess yet? Anyway, once the fingers are all done and attached, it's time to go over everything and make sure all of the proportions are correct. For instance, I accidentally gave Mina baby hands, so I had to fix that. For a short moment, I experimented with using sharps to represent the creases where the fingers bend and immediately changed my mind, touched up the feet to make them more flat and on the ground, adjusted the thickness of the fingers, and while we were taking screenshots for Twitter, realized I completely forgot that her overcoat is supposed to go down to her knees. Fuck. After several seconds of silent contemplation, I took the edges where her overcoat ended on her torso and extruded them out into an actual overcoat that looked natural draping around her legs and then clipping through her tail. Of course, this would be an issue that would be solved through rigging, and that would be for another video. But otherwise, I nailed it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and this new format that I'm trying out. It's something that I've wanted to try for a while now. Be sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment telling me that you like this video. It's one of the only ways for me to know that it's actually worth continuing. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say, so see ya.